Sometimes you pick up a book because someone compared it to The Secret History, and immediately your expectations, well, they're high. And usually it ends badly. Because it's like The Secret History has become publishing shorthand for there is a school, probably some wealthy, rich, weird kids, and someone says something vaguely philosophical. And eventually someone looks moody near a window. And every now and then, a book actually earns that comparison. And The Orchard is one of the few dark academia novels I've read outside of The Secret History that doesn't feel like it's desperately trying to wear someone else's Ralph Lauren blazer. It absolutely takes notes from The Secret History. It knows exactly what kind of literary space it's entering. But instead of just being an awkward cosplayer, pretending to be Donna Tartt's fever dream, it does something genuinely interesting. It asks, what happens if you take all the dark academic obsession with intellectual seduction, elite social circles, moral ambiguity, and identity crises and drop it into Orthodox Judaism? And honestly, that's such an interesting premise that even when this book stumbles, and it does stumble, it completely locks you in. This is one of those books where I spent the entire time thinking, I'm not sure this fully works, but I'm having a really good time anyway. And weirdly, I think that's more interesting to talk about a book like this that isn't either obviously brilliant or obviously bad, because The Orchard is caught between two identities. It wants to be this literary, sharp, dark academia adult novel, but it also wants to be a coming of age young adult novel. And for the most of the book, it feels like it's trying to keep its foot in both worlds without fully committing to either. Sometimes that tension can work. Sometimes it feels like the book itself is having the same identity crises as the protagonist. And honestly, that's why it stuck with me. So The Orchard follows Ari, a teenage boy raised in a deeply Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn. His world is structured, ordered, defined. There are expectations, rules, a very clear understanding of what life looks like and how faith is meant to shape your way of life. Then the family moves to Florida, and suddenly he's dropped into a very different kind of Orthodox Jewish environment. Still religious, still rooted in tradition, but far wealthier, looser, more socially fluid, and less rigid in ways that he finds unsettling. And that's where this book really becomes compelling. Because on paper, this setup could become a very standard fish out of water YA story. New school, new social hierarchies, new friendships. Maybe some awkward attempts to fit in. You know the kind of thing. You've read it a million times before. But the author here pushes it to a much stronger, more psychological territory. Ari becomes pulled into the orbit of this intellectually magnetic group of students led by Noah. And yes, that already sounds a little familiar to dark academia readers. You're not imagining it. It's a very familiar setup. There's definitely some of the seductive, intellectual cliche energy here. The feeling of being invited into a world that seems more meaningful, more enlightened, elevated than your ordinary life. The kind of social circle that makes everyone outside it feel incredibly boring. And that's where the novel really starts working, because it understands what makes this kind of story compelling. It's never just whether the protagonist gets accepted, it's about what being accepted costs. What that erasure of certainty is. How it becomes increasingly intoxicated by ideas. And in Ari's case, those ideas that are tied directly into faith. That's what makes the Orchard feel very distinct. The intellectual tension here isn't built around obscure Greek texts or depicted architecture or aesthetics. It's theological, spiritual, existential. These characters aren't just wrestling with abstract philosophy because it sounds cool over overpriced bottles of wine. They're wrestling with God, with devotion, with religious expectations, with what it actually means to experience faith rather than simply inherit it. And I found that interesting, genuinely, because it gives the book away a lot of dark academia novels never achieve. Because a lot of dark academia novels, The Four is a prime example of this, lean into that territory of this exists so we can do horrible things to the protagonist for no apparent reason. Or the books fall into that space of love, of the aesthetics of intellectual depth. But very few engage with the ideas in any way that is meaningful. The Orchard does. Even when it occasionally gets a little too eager to prove that it's the smart one in the pack, there's some real substance underneath all of this. Then there are the real questions being explored. As someone who's been reading and read a lot of books dealing with Jewish thought, theology, and religious identity, I appreciate how seriously this book took those themes. It doesn't reduce faith to set dressing. It centers to everything, every decision, every conflict, everything, every moment of self-doubt. And this gives Ari's internal struggle real force, because this isn't teenage rebellion. It's not simply strict upbringing meets freedom. It's much more nuanced collision between inherited certainty and lived ambiguity. And I think that's where the novel is at its strongest. That said, this is one of its biggest weaknesses it starts to show. Because I really do think this book couldn't quite decide who it's for. And that the tension is present is almost every aspect of this book. There's this pull. The characters often feel written with YA sensibilities, their emotional responses, their interpersonal dynamics, some of the dialogue, the rhythm of their relationship. There's a distinct YA structure to how all of these interactions unfold. But the themes, the atmosphere, the everything else, it's all reaching towards something far more adult. And those two energies don't always blend smoothly. At times it feels like reading two different versions of the same book laid on top of each other. One is a thoughtful adult literature, dark academia novel about theology, class, and spiritual uncertainty, and the other is a polished coming of age YA novel. And instead of fully merging, they occasionally pull each other apart. I kept wishing that the writer had committed harder to one lane, and personally I'd love to see this lean more fully adult, because the setting is rich enough, the ideas are strong enough, the atmosphere is there. There's a sharper, more unsettling version of this story buried underneath the surface, a version that pushes further into discomfort, the moral complexities that this kind of genre invites. And every now and then you catch a glimpse of that version. Moments where the novel feels like it's about to become something truly exceptional, and then it pulls back. Not enough to ruin it, but it's also not enough to make it feel watered down, but it's enough that you notice. Enough that you start thinking what could have been. And that's why this is such a interesting book to talk about, because I liked it. I genuinely liked it. If I was doing stars, and I've never fully convinced star ratings are useful, I'd probably land on a solid 3 out of 5. Which sounds more lukewarm than I actually feel about it. This is one of those books that's far more memorable than a lot of 4-star, 5-star reads because of its ambiguities, because it's trying something very specific. Even when it doesn't fully land, it reaches something worth reaching for. And I'd rather read a slightly messy novel than a completely forgettable one. And The Orchard is absolutely not forgettable. It lingers. There's lots of questions. The atmosphere is good. The strange blend of adolescence uncertainty and theological intensity lingers. I do need to mention one particular issue, though. If you're reading the ebook, there's a formatting problem with some of the Hebrew text. It appears reversed in places, which obviously isn't ideal. Um, and for a novel where language and religious texture matter, this kind of issue becomes pretty noticeable. It doesn't destroy the experience, but if you read Hebrew, it does pull you out of the story a little bit. Hopefully, they'll correct that in some new editions, because it's a frustrating technical problem in a book that otherwise feels really carefully constructed. What I appreciated most about The Orchard is that it expands what dark academia can be. The genre has become increasingly predictable, especially with the rise of book talk and the young adult side of things. Too many books just remix the same ideas interchangeably. Elite schools, cold weather, pretentious conversations, a murder if they're feeling adventurous, everyone vaguely miserable. And look, I enjoy that as much as the next person, but it's refreshing to read a book that takes that framework and applies it to something genuinely new. Orthodox Jewish life is such an interesting lens for those themes. Questions of belonging, discipline, introspection, devotion, rebellion, community, identity all become sharper through that setting. It gives the genre a new texture. And I'd love to see more books take similar risks, because when dark academia actually engages with specific cultures, philosophies, or theologies, that framework, instead of just borrowing the aesthetic surface level stuff, again, the four, it becomes much richer. I'm quite proud to put this next to my shelf with Donna Tartt. So overall, I absolutely recommend The Orchard if you feel curious about dark academia but want something outside the usual formula. If you loved The Secret Histories and keep searching for books that capture that same pull without just copying it, this is worth your time. Just go in knowing it's a little caught between readerships, a little uncertain of exactly what it wants to be, and but sometimes this book, in that in-between space, is the most interesting to read. Some of those, you can feel that pull. And The Orchard feels like a novel written by someone who's with genuinely interesting ideas, who maybe hasn't fully settled into exactly how he wants to tell them yet. Which makes me really curious to see what this writer does next, because if this is what he's doing this early on, there's lots of potential here. And honestly, any book that makes me immediately want more Jewish dark academia, well, it's probably done something right. I'm Darth James. Remember, you can support this channel with Patreon, Substack, and all the usual stuff for early access and a podcast and exclusives. You can also leave a comment, hype this video, and subscribe and hit that little bell icon. Every little helps on this platform. So I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.